So, it turns out when I wasn't paying attention, things completely changed for HDMI 2.1 on Linux. Most of you probably know that HDMI 2.1 was basically a no-go this entire time. Now, you can obviously use the HDMI 2.1 ports, but they won't run at that speed. They'll run at 2.0 speeds, which for most people is fine. But if you want to do some weird complicated setups, you want to make use of the crazy bandwidth you have with HDMI 2.1, you just were not able to do so. Most of the discussion was centered around this thread: 4K at 120Hz unavailable via HDMI 2.1. Obviously, most people are not doing that, but if you have a monitor that does it, and you have hardware that should be able to push it, not being able to do that with a port on your system is very, very annoying. And this was not for literally any technical reason. NVIDIA, they have support. They've had support pretty much this entire time, and that's just not been a concern for them. The reason it's not been a concern is their support was done in their proprietary drivers. AMD on Linux has always had an open stack. Now, there are certain closed parts, firmware, things like that, but majority open stack. This was entirely caused by the HDMI forum. The people who defined the HDMI spec didn't want it to happen. From Phoronix back in 2021, HDMI forum closing public specification access is hurting open source GPU drivers. It's been recently elaborated why the likes of FreeSync support of HDMI aren't coming to the open source drivers, at least not yet. It stems from the decision by the HDMI forum to prevent public access to the HDMI specification, which in turn is hurting open source graphics drivers. This is specifically a problem with HDMI. If you only use DisplayPort, you can just do whatever you want because DisplayPort is an open standard. You can get full specification with it. It's totally fine. The main reason why we care about HDMI is the TVs, which are pretty much the HDMI forum anyway, and then the game consoles. If the game consoles ever said, hey, we're going to go DisplayPort, things would probably change then, but I just don't see that happening. With the HDMI specification no longer being public, but only to HDMI adopters, basically HDMI forum members, this is complicating the open source driver support. Even for those that are part of the HDMI forum like AMD, in turn, cannot provide an open source implementation of features covered by the closed source spec for in turn potentially and indirectly opening up aspects for it to the public. This has been an absolute nightmare. This is not a problem on Windows, because on Windows they have their proprietary stack and all that stuff is fine. But on Linux, we care about open source, and I don't want AMD to just have a closed source driver stack as the only stack on Linux. So this has been a problem that we've pretty much just had to deal with this entire time. I basically only use HDMI for my slower monitors, so it doesn't really matter to me that much. But for people who have monitors that want to use the HDMI, they've been pretty much stuck. When this became a problem that most people were aware of was back in 2024 with this AMD engineer. The HDMI forum has rejected our proposal, unfortunately. At this time, an open source HDMI 2.1 implementation is not possible without running afoul of the HDMI forum requirements. AMD wants to do it. AMD was willing to do it. The HDMI forum was like, nope. You don't get to. Even though, to my understanding, AMD already had the code working, they had access to the spec, they were not allowed to release it because the HDMI forum did not want an open source implementation of it, because an open source implementation by necessity would leak details of the spec, and the spec was not public, and they didn't want it to be public, so it basically created this situation where nothing could really be done. Now, hardware could be redesigned so all of the ports were just built in DisplayPort to HDMI converters, and that would deal with the problem. But even though that is the case, Linux is still the smallest platform for AMD, so they would prefer to not have to do that. And if you have hardware where it currently has these ports, right? You don't want to have to buy a new GPU because the GPU you had has a perfectly working port, but you're just told it's not allowed to work. Whilst this would stop the AMD engineers, this wouldn't stop the regular AMD users and regular developers. Whilst AMD couldn't exactly comment on the work and sort of help to improve it, deal with bugs, and really get it merged upstream, especially getting it merged upstream, it wasn't going to stop other people fixing it themselves. So this thread basically became the place that people discussed what the problem is, how to address the problem, sort of attempts to try and resolve it, trying out hardware, things like that. Maybe something can be done, and there's just something hidden there that's magically going to work. Now, it wasn't going to magically work, but it did bring a lot of people together to talk about the problem and get the problem really well known. And one developer with the moniker MKOPEC wanted to try and resolve this problem. They had been involved in the thread for quite a while. They had been trying to troubleshoot the problem and sort of identify the issues that various people are having and talk about things that are going on and lead people to other things that might help resolve the problem, like adapters and things like that. But obviously, it wasn't going to help until some code was actually written. They reached out to AMD people. Alex was still saying, hey, discussions are happening. Nothing really happened at the time, but keeping people aware that things were still going on. And then eventually, pointing out things that the HDMI forum was not too happy about, like the HDMI 2.1 spec having been leaked publicly, not linked here, but was publicly available online. So the idea that you're just going to say, oh, we're not going to have an open source implementation because the spec would be leaked, kind of becomes a moot point. Now, that didn't mean the HDMI forum was just going to change their mind. They could still keep just saying, we're not going to do anything, and at the time, that's pretty much the stance they had, but it at least sort of weakens that argument and creates a space for some kind of discussion. Then, earlier this year of 2026, they made this set of patches I talked about a couple of months ago, HDMI 2.1 FRL looking for testers. I've successfully managed to implement HDMI FRL in AMD GPU, enabling full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth on your AMD GPUs. This was a set of custom patches that could obviously be applied to a custom compiled kernel, which would pretty much deal with the problem. It was not fully implemented, it was not fully tested, it wasn't necessarily going to work on every single display, but the ball was rolling. This is someone who was starting to write the code and get some sort of implementation done, even though HDMI Forum doesn't want it to happen, even though AMD was not allowed to release it. Because this wasn't someone who knew about the spec, this was basically a reverse engineering effort. There wasn't really much they could do, and it didn't seem like the HDMI Forum really cared enough to do anything. Especially since there were already open implementations like Xilinx, which belongs to AMD, and had MIT licensed FRL training code, so like, that at least part of it was already implemented, and there are other implementations out there as well, so it just didn't make any sense that you couldn't at the very least do that part of it. Those patches from Reddit were also shared on this thread as well, and people did start to take note of them. People like, ooh, work is being done here. Again though, as the HDMI forum was blocking this work was probably not going to get upstreamed at the time because it would be an AMD GPU, right? The driver that is developed by AMD engineers, but AMD engineers weren't allowed to have a implementation of this, so AMD engineers couldn't maintain the code. So even if the code was good and even if the code worked, you couldn't actually have it merged upstream because AMD engineers weren't allowed to touch it. There was this whole mess. But at the very least, they weren't stopping anyone having these discussions in the AMD thread. At the time, even if AMD wanted to have the code merged, they just couldn't legally do so. That is, until now. So we know that AMD either had a full implementation or certainly working on an implementation that was pretty much ready. And we also know that with the Steam Machine sometime this year, probably soon-ish, and it having HDMI 2.1 and Valve certainly being interested in having the problem be resolved so they can actually have the hardware they have in their machine operating at the speeds it's supposed to be operating at. And we don't know what discussions went on behind closed doors, but we do know for a fact that both AMD and Valve were discussing things with the HDMI forum. And this has resulted in another change occurring. This has resulted in a big, big difference. So, from the same Alex from earlier, initial patches available here, more to come once ready. This is a link to the Linux kernel mailing list, HDMI FRL support for AMD GPU sent up to the kernel. This was sent by another AMD engineer, Harry Wentland. This patch series adds HDMI FRL support to the AMD GPU display driver. DSC is still being tested and will be sent out later. This work passed a representative subset of HDMI compliance, and a full compliance run on this branch is in the works. We don't expect the full run to show any failures since it passes in other environments. That means they have a lot more to show. Thanks to Sakara, who prepared this work a couple of years back, and unfortunately didn't manage to send them while he was still working at AMD, not because he didn't want to, but because HDMI forum. Thanks to Jerry, who has been making this code solid on Linux and running the compliance tests. The first patch, but included here because it moved the code around some key bits of the HDMI 2.1 stuff around too much. It will land with the next DC patch. Did I double up a sentence there, or did that just make no sense? Whilst this not be merged into the kernel just yet, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be merged, besides bugs and things like that, because, well, this is the AMD GPU driver developed by AMD GPU engineers, so I don't really see any reason why, unless there's something really wrong with it, it's just not going to be merged. If the HDMI forum is okay with this happening, then it seems like this is happening. Also, some third-party developers, because this has not yet been merged, have been working on compiling some work together, making it easy for people to go and use this in a separate kernel tree, and hopefully, very shortly, this is not going to be required. But if that was the end of it, I probably wouldn't have made the video today. Maybe I would have, but when he says, right here, more to come once they are ready, he did clarify that over on Phoronix. A full implementation will ultimately be available once the patches are ready and have completed compliance testing. I am still waiting with bated breath. This can absolutely still go south until the code has been submitted, until the code has been released. But there is some hope. There is still hope of this happening. About a day or so ago, don't know when you guys are seeing this, more of this work has been submitted up to the kernel. HDMI FRL and DSC support for AMD GPU, again by Harry Wentland. I don't know what changed. I don't know what caused this change from the HDMI forum that allowed this to happen. I would assume having the spec leaked a while back probably hurt the idea of, by not having this in an open source implementation, we're going to make sure the spec isn't leaked. If the spec has been leaked, the spec has been leaked. No implementation is going to protect you from the fact that the documentation is just available online. I don't know what happened. All I do know is, at least for now, this is a positive change. The better change would be migrating off of HDMI, but if HDMI ports are going to be on the cards, they're going to be on monitors, and they're going to be on things like capture cards, it's a problem you kind of have to deal with. This is a positive change in terms of HDMI 2.1. What it doesn't address is the the more recent problem. So, back at CES 2025, HDMI 2.2 announced, still with restricted licensing. My understanding, and we don't have 2.2 hardware currently available to consumers, my understanding is these changes probably would not account for this. So we're probably going to be in the exact same situation that we were in before. Wait about 5 or 6 years, and then maybe HDMI 2.2 is going to work. What I think is legitimately going to happen here is we're probably going to lag a version behind. This legitimately could be a reason why they're willing to do it. They're working on the next spec. The next spec is going to be not publicly available, like hardware is going to be available soon, so there's less of a reason to go and protect the old one. I don't want that to be what's happened. I want this to be a change of heart, and AMD is just allowed to implement things properly, but I really do expect that in a couple of months from now, we're going to be talking about the exact same problem once again. It's just been incremented by 0.1. But let me know, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think this is a positive change for the future, or we're just going to end up repeating the past again? I really hope not, but knowing the HDMI forum, my hope is very little. Anyway, if you liked the video, go like the video, go subscribe as well, and if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon subscribes Daily Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and give me HD.
Something.